Thanks. Thanks for coming back. And we just got back. We'd been waiting. I was going to read this morning, so maybe if we have some little time at the end, I'll do it. But it's Chris Pike, who was unable to attend, who's writing a book on Penn Jones, sent a paper, and it just finally got faxed here to me from the front desk. So I've been waiting on this fax. But our next speaker is Peter Dell Scott, who filled in for our keynote on Friday, and many of you, if not all of you, know already. But Peter's been working on a book, Road to 9/11, and as he did the book, he was telling me he's seeing so much that's pertinent within the 9/11 research, referring back to the deep politics work that he's done on the Kennedy assassination. So his title is 9/11 and the Kennedy assassination and
what we can learn by studying both.
What we can learn by studying both, okay. So I'm sure he will enlighten you as soon as I can give him the clip. So you do the dirty? All right, I'll do it. Is that okay, Ralph?
Okay. Thank you very much. I have to use my glasses. I apologize. Yes, once again, the title of my talk is JFK and 9/11, Insights Gained from Studying Both. And I have to say that when I first imagined doing this talk, I thought, well, I probably know more at this stage about 9/11 than most of the people here who are professionally concerned with JFK. But doing this talk, which I only began last Monday, has been a real learning experience for myself, taking a lot of things which I already knew about each, but I had never really put together before, and when I did, they gave me a clearer view of what's happening beneath the scenes in both operations, because certain things repeat themselves. And these things that repeat themselves include what we might call external features, which you're very familiar with in the JFK case, the ability of the government to establish a guilty party or parties immediately, and the press immediate consumption of that product to the exclusion of all other possibilities. Eventually, in both cases, a commission is set up, the Warren Commission in '63, the 9/11 Commission, this time 2003. And the starting point for both commissions is to validate what was already decided by the FBI on the day in question. That's what the first of the common features that I would like to look at a bit more closely, because it sort of hit me between the eyes when I thought about the two together. Now, if you remember the case of Oswald, and I have to do this from memory, and correct me if I'm wrong on the details, but within minutes of the assassination, and long before Oswald has been picked up in the in the Texas theater, they put out on the police network and possibly other networks a description of the killer, 5'10", 165 pounds, which exactly matches what is in his FBI file, exactly matches what's in CIA documents about him. One of the problems is it doesn't match the actual height and weight of the man picked up and charged, which was more like 5'9" and 145 pounds. And it's also very suspect because as far as we can trace the origins of this exact fit with the FBI file, it's attributed to Howard Brennan, who saw someone 2 blocks from here in the 6th floor window from the waist up. So you have to figure out how he was able to get that exact thing. It's clear that they already knew who was going to be charged before they had found him in the Texas theater. Now, the parallel to that in 9/11 is, I have to say, even more astounding. Because Richard Clark, who is the director of counterterrorism activities in the White House and a very important eyewitness in his book, Against All Enemies, almost totally ignored by the 9/11 Commission, and it had to be ignored because what he says is at odds in many, many important respects, some of which I'll come back to, with what the 9/11 report says. But he tells us that at 9:59 a.m. on September the 11th, which is the time when the second tower collapses, North Tower, the FBI already had the names of 18 of the 19 hijackers. And this is extraordinary in the first place because the FBI always says about itself that it doesn't do much intelligence in the field of terrorism. Its specialty was criminal investigations afterwards. They had all these names, including 3 of the 4 hijackers on Flight 93. Well, at 9:59 a.m., Flight 93 had not yet crashed. And even more astonishingly, if we believe the 9/11 report, which of course, on this point, I do not believe the 9/11 report, but it tells us solemnly that NORAD, who was searching for the hijacked planes, wasn't aware that Flight 93 had been hijacked until 10:08, which is 9 minutes after the FBI already has 3 of the 4 names of the hijackers on the plane. So it's worth thinking about that for a moment, the 2 events together, and then the other things that we know about, how always the identity of the person who is going ultimately to be identified as the culprit is established at the very beginning. Sirhan, the bag with the gun which identifies James Earl Ray. It isn't investigative work after the assassination that finds these people. It's just following up on what is already there from the very beginning. And as I say, that is the first thing that strikes my mind about the similarities between the 2 events. And then we come to what I would call internal continuities of content. And, historically, I was first drawn to this because when the news of the Watergate break-in was in the New York Times on June the 17th, 1972, and I remember quite vividly, there was Frank Sturgis, alias Frank Fiorini, that I had already written about in the Dallas conspiracy a year before because of his role in perpetrating false Oswald stories, what I now call Phase 1 Oswald stories, linking him falsely to Cuba. And I could go on and on about that, but I just want to say that in the new paperback edition of Lamar Waldron's book, Ultimate Sacrifice, we find validation of a very old story that Hunt and McCord, whom we may loosely call two of the Watergate burglars, and certainly the 2 who were controlling the fate of the rest, worked together in 1963. This was an old charge which was more or less forgotten, but is revived in this book, and in my mind, credibly. I just put myself on record that I was not impressed with the hardback edition of Ultimate Sacrifice. I've only really in this week begun to read the paperback edition, and I have my issues with a lot of the things in there, but I'm convinced that it has to be taken seriously, and that whether or not he's right in his central thesis, he is right in a lot of the supportive detail that he's gathered for it, and it has the advantage of being a very thoroughly documented book. The quality of the documentation goes up and down, but there is a great deal of it. And now I want to come to a common denominator between what happened in '63 and what happened in 2001. And it's not often discussed, but by coincidence, I think it's being discussed right now in the other place, as we call it, the role of the White House Communications Agency. And I wonder, you're all JFK researchers. How many of you have ever asked yourself questions about the role of the WHCA on November 20th, '63? Anybody? Well, I'm indebted to Rex, who, of course, is administering the website of the Mary Ferrell Foundation. There are a very few documents there, and I'm going to draw on those documents. This is what's so wonderful about the Mary Ferrell Foundation. We never need to go to the National Archives again. You just, a few touches of the finger on your keyboard and you get these things. It's going to help us with what I consider a very crucial and unresolved question about 9/11. And I'm sorry that I have to telescope so much here. My big question and the focus of my forthcoming book, The Road to 9/11, out of that huge book with 14 chapters, there's only 2 on 9/11 itself. And both of them are looking exclusively, really, or almost exclusively, at what Dick Cheney did between 9 a.m. and 10:39 on that morning, because there are different accounts of it. And interesting, there are different accounts from Dick Cheney himself, incompatible accounts. And it's, I believe, a very important issue, because either he was in the bunker, what we call the PEOC, under the White House, when 2 crucial orders were made, a stand-down order that got all the planes down on the ground, which came out of the bunker, and a shoot-down order to shoot down any remaining hijacked planes, of which at this point there was only one, Flight 93, which of course is the plane which should not have been shot down, according to the official version, because the passengers were taking care of the problem themselves. And there's no doubt, everybody agrees, including the 9/11 report, that both these orders occurred. And there's no doubt that the first one was at 9:42, and there is great confusion as to whether the second order was around 9:45, which is what Richard Clark says. He says it was before Air Force One took off at 9:54, or whether, as the report says, it was probably around 10:15 a.m., which of course would have been after Flight 93 had already crashed. Now, when did Cheney come into the PEOC? He spoke to Tim Russert on Meet the Press 6 days afterwards, on September 16th, and said that he got there before the plane, if that's what it was, flew into the Pentagon, which was at 9:37. And I believe him on September the 16th. And then in November, he was interviewed by Newsweek, and that appeared in Newsweek on December 31st, and it's the basis for the story in the 9/11 report, that he didn't arrive, and that's the report's word, in the bunker until shortly before 10 a.m., probably around 9:58. You'll notice that if that's the case, then he was not present for either order, although we have many sources who say that he was there for the first, and the only coherent reading of Richard Clark's book is that he transmitted to Clark the shoot-down order sometime before 9:54. What I think happened, and this is where we're going to get back to JFK, is that Cheney did indeed arrive quite early in the bunker, as Norman Mineta, who was also there, testified, with a very interesting story I can't get into here. And then he left, and this is the interesting thing. He left the bunker, went back into the tunnel leading to the bunker, and here I'm following the report now. From the bunker, he made the crucial phone call to Bush, and perhaps an even more crucial phone call to Rumsfeld, which Rumsfeld has testified to, but the report ignores, which was about 3 things. One was protecting Air Force One, which is irrelevant. 2, which I wish I could get into, it's the heart of my book, instituting COG, continuity of government, which I say is really change of government, because it's often been called a plan for the suspension of the U.S. Constitution, and that's a pretty accurate summary of it. And how many of you know it was actually instituted on 9/11? That is perhaps one of the most important things that happened on 9/11, and it happened because of this phone call, and there is no record of the phone call. And I think it's pretty obvious there's no record of the phone call because he wasn't in the bunker where people were taking notes and logs were being kept. He went to a back channel from a secure phone somewhere. There's no question. Everybody agrees, including Cheney himself, that he used a secure phone in the tunnel to make this call. Now, this could be resolved by going to the records of the White House Communications Agency. They kept logs, the Secret Service kept logs, and we have logs from that day which record a trivial phone call at 9:15 a.m. and another trivial phone call at 10:15 a.m. But Thomas Keane, the chairman of the commission, complained publicly that the logs were not complete. We have the equivalent of an 18-minute gap, which some of you will remember from the Watergate investigation. The commission does not present any records from the logs for the time of the phone call, either because they never saw them, possibly because the logs had been massaged and cleansed and purged before they got to them, possibly because the commission purged them themselves, or, and this is what I believe, and I think we should think about very seriously, because the phone in the tunnel was in essentially a back channel for which the normal logs were not kept, possibly because it was of a higher classification because it involved continuity of government. And one of the things that I would press for is for Congress to, when we start suing for the records that don't get released in 2009, to get released all of the documents in this period pertaining to COG, which I believe will tell us about warrantless wiretapping, about building of detention camps for large numbers of undesirable people like us, and so on and so on. I think this is a very important topic. Let me see where I am in my notes here. Anyway, so because I noticed this gap, first of all, I had a researcher contact the press officer of the WHCA, and they very helpfully said, well, put in a FOIA request. Well, the poor old ARRB wasn't able to spring significant documents from the WHCA, so I didn't bother to try on my own. I did go, however, to their website, and what I read there was, and this is a direct quote now, WHCA was also a key player in documenting the assassination of President Kennedy. Well, this struck me as extremely interesting because I don't know who they documented it before, but I can tell you on the basis of my research, they didn't document it for the Warren Commission because the Warren Commission never got their records. And neither did the ARRB. And there is actually a section of the ARRB report where they say, and I think they were much too limited in your curiosity, but it came to their attention that phone calls out of Air Force One flying back to Washington were in, of all places, the LBJ library. Well, they figured, well, if they're in the LBJ library, then we should get them for the, the whole set released. And their report says, well, we can't locate any records. What they should really have asked for, I think, and this really, I believe, would have documented the JFK assassination, were WHCA records before the shots were fired, leading up to the moment that the shots were fired. And as I said, they only requested records from Air Force One, which is to say sometime after. However, a few documents were released, and this is the beauty of the Mary Farrell Foundation. You can read them, and what we read there is remarkably resonant with what I discovered with respect to 9/11, which was that in the post-shooting period, the regular switchboard in Washington was out of touch with Dallas. And the only way they were spent the whole time trying to patch through to Fort Worth, which in turn would patch through to Dallas. But at the same time, they set up a back channel, just like what I was talking about 9/11. They set up a back channel in the hospital at Parkland with the Secret Service. And this is what really gets me interested, because in 9/11, I became fascinated that the WHCA channel was in effect the Secret Service channel, and the Secret Service knew everything that was happening on 9/11 immediately, including what was ever on the screens at FAA or NORAD. That information was going directly and immediately to the Secret Service, and therefore, of course, to Cheney, who had a Secret Service agent with him. That, I think, will turn out, I make this prediction, that will, if we ever get to the next layer of what happened on that day, we will become extremely interested in that Secret Service network, identical with the White House Communication Agency, and, as I say, involving two levels, a regular set of communications and a back channel where the significant action is happening. And what was really interesting was that the main switchboard for the WHCA, to judge from the reports which they filed, were totally unaware that a back channel was operating. I'll read this this is on the Mary Farrell Foundation. Direct communication set up immediately, direct, between agent directly outside of emergency room, that's at Parkland, and Mr. Bain, the special agent in charge of the White House Secret Service detail. So it wasn't even a back channel back to the WHCA. It was to the head of the Secret Service detail in his office in Washington, which became the Washington Command Post and Clearinghouse. Now, what do we know about what's happening in that command post on that day? Almost nothing. But what I learned from 9/11 is that is where we should look to learn more about JFK. And I think that potentially, and here I'm only speculating, that if we ever got to the pre-shots things, it would explain why Winston Lawson, for example, stopped where, right in front of the school book depository, where a man was having a so-called epileptic fit, which led to the Dallas police ordering that a direct pathway be opened to Parkland Hospital, so that when the shooting of the president occurred, the president's car was like a pea in a pea shooter. There was only one place it could go, which was to Parkland, all arranged because of the closing of exit roads on the freeway so that the epileptic could arrive. And those of you who know the story, the man who, when he got there, he got off the stretcher and said, "I feel fine, I didn't really have an epileptic fit at all." He had changed history or affected history, but he hadn't had a fit. Now, I've got two or maybe three more. Are you persuaded, by the way, so far that it is worth looking at the two together so that you get... All right, here's a broader one, which many of you say, oh, there he goes again, as on the question of drugs. And in Deep Politics, and especially in Deep Politics 2, which, thanks to Rex, is about to be reissued, I believe, and will be available shortly from the Mary Farrell Foundation, I discussed the importance of the Mexican drug traffic as a factor which was connected to Jack Ruby, which was connected to the Mexican DFS, which taped Oswald in Mexico City, connected to Richard Kane, this very multifaceted Chicago mob and law enforcement figure who was the chief link between Sam Giancana and the Mexican establishment, and who may very well, as I say in Deep Politics 2, have been his specialty was wiretapping and it's conceded publicly that he did wiretapping in Mexico, wiretapping of foreign embassies in Mexico City for the Mexican government, which certainly sounds pretty relevant to the overhearing of a man who identified himself as Lee Oswald, and also some of the Cubans, and I may come back to them, the Cubans, particularly Artemis Cubans, SNFE Cubans, who were involved in the drug traffic. And at that point I first wrote this, I had not yet looked at the new version of Ultimate Sacrifice and realized that the Mexican drug connection is, if anything, even more important in Waldron's book than it is in mine, which perhaps explains my new partiality to want to take that book seriously. And he brings in people like, for example, the French connection, and whoever he was, René Sweat or Mertz, who was the CIA later reported in Dealey Plaza or in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. He ties those people to Marcello and to Trafficante and to Roselli, and there are more people. I mean, I could give the rest of the talk just on that theme, but I won't. Now, just to position the current position of the George W. Bush administration, what they feel about drug traffickers. I don't know, how many of you were following the case of Luis Posada Carriles, who was, nobody denies he's a terrorist. He boasted that he was a terrorist. He is not quite admitting to having blown up a Cuban airliner in 1976, but he is very proud of having arranged raids on Cuban resorts in 1998, which resulted in the death of a tourist. He actually had interviews with an American journalist to try and draw publicity to this fact, because he said, what's the point of killing tourists if nobody knows that the tourist traffic is going to continue? And then, of course, he was ultimately picked up for trying to assassinate Castro in Panama in the year 2000. Well, we know how tolerant the Reagan-Bush 1 administration was towards him, because Bush Sr. arranged for Felix Rodriguez to be running the Ilopango base in El Salvador, and Rodriguez turned around and gave a job to Luis Posada Carriles, who was still wanted for these crimes but was now on the run. And then when that all closed down in the 1990s, and here I'm quoting from a Mexican journal called Por Esto, Posada Carriles was protected in Guatemala, Belize, and Mexico by narco-traffickers in the Central American cartel headed by Otto Herrera Garcia, an associate of the major Mexican trafficker Ismael Zambada. And the State Department website says of Otto Herrera Garcia, in 2001 alone, his organization moved approximately 12 metric tons of cocaine and may have the ability to smuggle as much as 2 tons of cocaine into the United States each month. Well, you might think that at this point Posada Carriles would be in the bad graces of the American government. No. He was smuggled into this country, and the man who smuggled him in, who clearly committed a crime, has not been arrested for any crime. And Posada, when he again drew attention to himself, got himself detained, and he wants asylum. And I think he's going to get it, because the U.S. government has either to extradite him, which I guarantee they won't do, or prosecute him or release him. And in fact, at this point, the clock is ticking. They have 3 months or less now to decide what to do with him. Well, the reason they can't prosecute him is that when he came back, the FBI at that moment in Miami decided not to prosecute him and destroyed all of the Posada Carriles files. And the man who did this is a Cuban American whose father came out of that exile network where they all knew each other and protected each other. So that kind of protection lives into this generation. And I just have to say, because I'm in such a burn about this, that Orlando Bosch, who was a co-conspirator in the blowing up of the plane and was able to pay for an acquittal in Latin America, came back without a record, was sponsored for U.S. citizenship and obtained it, sponsored by Jeb Bush. And then shortly before, and this gives me even more of a burn, shortly before the 9/11 occurred, the two men who are confessed killers of Letelier and Moffett right in Washington, who it took years to get them convicted because of the interference from George Bush Sr. They were finally convicted, and after serving 7 years for this spectacular terrorist assassination, they were, I don't know if it was paroled or pardoned, but anyway, let out of jail by the new George W. Bush administration. So those Cuban American exiles still have their claws into the intelligence, security, justice network that is so interwoven with them. And that is going to be the theme of the second half of my talk. Well, so drugs is still a factor with intelligence. And the question is, now that we're facing Al-Qaeda, what is the relationship of Al-Qaeda to drugs? And is it similar to what I think drugs was being a factor in the background of the John F. Kennedy assassination? Well, there are two takes on this. Let me give you, first of all, what the British Parliament was told on October 4th, 2001, and that is that Al-Qaeda's activity includes substantial exploitation of the illegal drugs trade from Afghanistan. Now let's listen to what the 9/11 report has to say on the same subject. They didn't have to say anything, by the way, but they went out of their way to say this. While the drug trade was a source of income for the Taliban, it did not serve the same purpose for Al-Qaeda, and there is no reliable evidence that bin Laden was involved in or made his money through drug trafficking. And this was after the U.S. Central Command report that in December 2003, a dhow was intercepted near the Strait of Hormuz carrying almost 2 tons of hashish valued at up to $10 million. And the CENTCOM statement said that there were, quote, clear ties between the shipment and Al-Qaeda. Well, if that's true, why did the 9/11 report go out of its way to say there is no evidence linking bin Laden to drug trafficking? I want to close on this part of my talk with the allegations of Sibel Edmonds, and unfortunately we don't really know what they are because she's under a gag order. That for reasons of state, she's not allowed to tell the public what she told the FBI, which resulted, she was a whistleblower who naively did what a whistleblower should do in the name of protecting the American public order and got fired for it, and she is still fighting to appeal her case. She can't talk, but she has talked here and there, and my friend Daniel Ellsberg is very interested in her case, and very recently he summed up what she's saying for KPFA, my local Pacifica radio station. This is Ellsberg's summary of what Sibel Edmonds is saying. Al-Qaeda, she's been saying to Congress, is financed 95% by drug money. Drug traffic to which the U.S. government shows a blind eye has been ignoring because it very heavily involves allies and assets of ours such as Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all the stands in a drug traffic where the opium originates in Afghanistan, is processed in Turkey, and delivered to Europe, where it furnishes 96% of Europe's heroin by Albanians, either in Albania or Kosovo, Albanian Muslims in Kosovo, basically the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which we backed heavily in that episode at the end of the century. That means the last century. And I will interrupt at this point. My book, I'm sure, I think I quite adequately document, A, that the KLA was deeply involved, or its leaders deeply involved in drug trafficking, and have used the NATO intervention as a way to consolidate a drug route through Kosovo, and B, that they were very heavily involved with Al-Qaeda, and that Zawahiri's brother came to organize KLA things, and Zawahiri himself may have come to Kosovo to organize them, at the same time that some of the key leaders were allied with American PMCs, private military corporations, notably DynCorp. With those of you who heard here last night heard Cynthia McKinney asking about DynCorp and why the Defense Department worked with them. There are war crimes attributable to KLA leaders who, in Croatia, when they were working hand in glove with DynCorp. And then Dan goes on to say, and I'm cutting out a great deal that's relevant, Sibel says that suitcases of cash have been delivered to the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, at his home near Chicago from Turkish sources, knowing that a lot of that is drug money. Well, these are very serious charges, and they aired to some extent in Vanity Fair. And they're so important that, of course, the media predictably ignored them. And I'm drawing attention to what she said now, not because I consider that what she's saying has been proven, but because I believe these charges are very serious and not just pertinent to 9/11 alone, but to the whole fabric of how this country is run. And I consider this a top priority for testing the honesty and credibility of the new Democratic leadership in Congress. Will they pursue these matters? And I hope that by hook or by crook you will try and put pressure on the new Democratic Congress to deal with these matters so that we get a proper investigation of them for the first time. And I just close this section by saying that whatever the details and whatever the extent of the situation she's describing, and it's not just her, by the way. There was another witness, Indira Singh, who was talking at a 9/11 conference up in Canada, and she said, I'm not going to go into the drug aspects of things because I was told that would be the death of me if I went into that. But this is a woman who has nothing to do with Sibel Edmonds, but alluded to the same problem in the background of 9/11. And we need to know more about that. And I suspect that whatever the situation is, it's something which goes back at least as far as 1963 and would then explain the same background for the Kennedy assassination. The most important thing I want to, this is all preliminary stuff. Now I get to the real stuff. Double agents. In Deep Politics, I explored at some length the possibility that Lee Harvey Oswald was, as Sylvia Odio had heard, a possible, and this is a quote, double agent trying to infiltrate the Dallas Cuban refugee group. And I went back and looked in what I had to say about this in Deep Politics, and I must say, in the light of 9/11, it blew my mind. I'm going to read from my own book, something I'd forgotten. The preceding chapter considered the possibility that Oswald associated with anti-Kennedy Cubans in order to investigate them on behalf of a federal agency. But we saw it alleged that Oswald was a double agent collaborating with some of these groups, either, as I suspect, because he or his handlers shared their goals, let's say their anti-Kennedy goals, or possibly because he or his handlers had been turned by those they were supposed to investigate. Such a possibility was particularly likely with targets like Alpha 66, about which the government itself was conflicted of two minds. And if you remember that Alpha 66 in early 1963 conducted a series of raids, not just against Cuba, but against Soviet ships in Cuba. It was obviously trying to shipwreck the U.S.-Soviet understanding on Cuba, and really, in a sense, was trying to torpedo the whole Kennedy policy of détente with the Soviet Union. And so there is no ambiguity about the total disapproval of the Justice Department, which cracked down on them and made a public announcement that they had to cease, and the continuing support from the CIA. Now, Waldron says David Phillips. I don't know that there's really evidence that David Phillips, he had an Alpha 66 connection at some point. I don't know that he was running those things, but it was certainly a group that was close to Phillips, and, may I add, extremely important in this book, the paperback edition of Ultimate Sacrifice. Let me read one more paragraph from Deep Politics. Here it is relevant that Alpha 66, although anti-Kennedy, was being used operationally by military intelligence. There are signs, albeit complex and inconclusive, that Oswald's strange and self-incriminating behavior in New Orleans and Dallas was staged to be documented in the secret files of military intelligence. And here I'll summarize this very briefly. I go into the way he volunteers, he asks for an FBI agent. Since this is an experiment we could all say, if we get ourselves arrested for an FBI, for a misdemeanor, and then say, we'd like the FBI to come and interview us, which is what Oswald said. How many of us are going to get an FBI agent to come down on a Saturday morning and talk to us? Well, anyway, Oswald had no problem in doing this. He then later talked to somebody in the police, and in both times he was talking about A.J. Heidel, and in both cases that information ended up somehow via the FBI agent with Army intelligence, via the police captain Martello with naval intelligence. So Oswald was enriching the files on himself in a way which would lead to his death in Dallas in November 1963. Well, what is so arresting about the connection here to 9/11 is I'm going to talk about another double agent, unmistakably, and a very important one, Ali Mohammed. How many people have heard of the name of Ali Mohammed before today? Almost nobody. Well, listen to this, because this is real stuff. It's important stuff. There's quite a lot about him now on my website because I've been speaking about him. It is striking that he was undeniably working with U.S. Army Special Forces, working with the CIA, almost certainly admitted to this country on a CIA visa, and in the last years certainly working with the FBI. He was actually detained in Canada by the RCMP, and he said, phone this number and you'll release me. And he phoned the West Coast office, the San Francisco office of the FBI, and sure enough, they released him immediately. And that meant he was able to go to Kenya, photograph the Kenyan embassy, deliver the photographs personally to Osama bin Laden, who said, put the truck here, said that to Ali Mohammed. And there's this new book just out. In fact, it arrived in my home the day before I caught a plane to come to Dallas, so I haven't had a very good read of it yet, but I've been following Peter Lance's. The book is Peter Lance's book, Triple Cross, and it says how bin Laden's master spy, that's Ali Mohammed, penetrated the CIA, the Green Berets, and the FBI, and why Patrick Fitzgerald failed to stop him. A very interesting story of which I have, as I say, quite a lot on my website. But what is particularly important here is that he has been protected not just under the George W. Bush administration, but from as early as 1990, when the FBI SOG, Special Operations Group in New York, photographed him training terrorists in terrorist activities, sharpshooting, etc. I'm going to name the names of some of his disciples and remember them for 60 seconds and then you can forget them. Abu Nosair, who went on to murder Meir Kahan, the Jewish racist, almost immediately, trained in sharpshooting by Ali Mohammed. Abu Halima and Salameh, who went on to participate in the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. And finally, a man called Rodney Hampton L., who was the one American-born black Muslim in the group, who clearly, again, had army backing because this was all for Afghanistan, and he was allowed to go to Fort Belvoir, and an army major gave him a list of Muslims in the U.S. Army whom he could recruit to go to Afghanistan. And you might say, well, of course, we were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, so it makes sense that they would approve this kind of activity. The problem is that the Soviets had totally withdrawn from Afghanistan by early 1989, and all of this is going on in 1990, at a time when the U.S. government, to paraphrase what I just said about 63, was of two minds about what to do in Afghanistan. You remember that Gorbachev is now the president of Russia, that the State Department, and I believe the White House, attached a lot of importance from Reagan's last years to rapprochement with the Soviet Union, and the State Department position was, let the Russians leave, lay off, stop our activities. The man they left in charge of Kabul, I think his name is Burhanuddin Rabbani, he said publicly, you may not like me in the West, but I'm the best you're going to get, and if you get rid of me, you're going to end up with a government of drug traffickers, which is essentially what we now have de facto in Afghanistan. And his prediction was entirely correct. The CIA was way off base here, with the support, obviously, of the U.S. Army. They were backing Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who some people have called the leading heroin trafficker in the world, to get rid of this secular, anti-Islamist government in Kabul, which we would, I think, pay an awful lot of money to get back at this stage, as preferable to what we have. So this was a conflicted program, and the fact that Ali Mohammed was doing it earned him high-level protection. There's so much I'm not telling you about how he was actually flying to Afghanistan and fighting while he was on the U.S. Army payroll, which is a definite no-no, and his commanding officer didn't like it, but there was nothing he could do about it because Ali Mohammed was being directed by another agency, and we can only guess what that other agency would have been. Anyway, a new book by Peter Lance confirms that Ali Mohammed, one of al-Qaeda's top trainers in terrorism, yes, top trainers in terrorism, including top training in hijacking, how to bring on box cutters, where to sit in the plane. And that's not against the Soviets, because you couldn't hijack a Soviet plane. There were no civilians ever got on Soviet planes in Afghanistan. So he was a top trainer. He was an operative for the FBI, the CIA, and the Army. And in my book, I write that in 1990, his trainees the U.S. were helping Army and CIA support the drug trafficker Hekmatyar in Afghanistan, even after the USSR withdrew. So back in 1990, the FBI knew these people were involved in conspiratorial activity, and I say they photographed, they videotaped Muhammad Ali training these people. And yet, when shortly afterwards, very shortly afterwards, Nasser went out and shot Meir Kahan, and because of his own lack of cool, ended up being shot himself and arrested. The police and the FBI told the public that he was, and you've heard this kind of language before, a lone deranged gunman who, and this is the FBI speaking, acted alone. Now here you have somebody who's part of a tolerated conspiracy, and when it accidentally goes public, because I don't think they anticipated the killing of Kahan, but they had to respond to it, that is their response. And at the time, first of all, they knew he wasn't acting alone because they had film of him training with all these other people. Now, Mohammed's trainees in America were all members of the Al-Kifa Center in Brooklyn, which served as the main American recruiting center for the Maktab al-Khidimat, the services center network that after the Afghan war became known as Al-Qaeda. we could roughly say this was the first, it has been said in print, the first al-Qaeda crime in America was the murder of Meir Kahane. The Al-Kafah Center was headed in 1990 by the blind Egyptian Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who, like Ali Mohammed, had been admitted to the United States on a CIA visa despite being on a State Department watch list. And as he had done earlier in Egypt, the Sheikh issued a fatwa in America that permitted his followers to rob banks and kill Jews. Now, in November 1990, 3 of the trainees conspired together to kill Meir Kahane. The actual killer, El-Sayed Nosair, was caught by accident almost immediately, and by luck, the police soon found his 2 co-conspirators, Mahmoud Abu Halima and Mohammed Salameh, waiting at Nosair's house. So they had the other 2 conspirators, and this is also what they found in Nosair's house, and I'm quoting here. There were formulas for bomb making, 1,440 rounds of ammunition, manuals from the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, marked top secret for training. May I say that those manuals, is no doubt, were supplied by Ali Mohammed, the double agent, and became the basis for the Al-Qaeda terrorist manual, which was mostly written by the double agent Ali Mohammed. The police found maps and drawings of New York City landmarks like the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, and the World Trade Center. The 47 boxes of evidence they collected also included the collected sermons of blind Sheikh Omar, in which he exhorted his followers to, quote, destroy the edifices of capitalism. So all 3, Nosair, Abu Halima, and Salameh, had been trained by Ali Mohammed. The FBI had photographed them, and if they had moved on and seized all 3 of them, we probably would not have had the first World Trade Center bombing, and we almost certainly would not have had the so-called landmarks conspiracy, where there was a plot to blow up these other landmarks you heard referred to, like the Statue of Liberty. And yet, only hours after the killing, Joseph Borelli, chief of NYPD detectives, struck a familiar American note and pronounced Nosair a, quote, lone, deranged gunman. And sometime later, he actually told the press, and this is the real giveaway, there was nothing at Nosair's house, nothing at Nosair's house that would stir your imagination. Nothing has transpired that changes our opinion that he acted alone. So that if 47 boxes of incriminating evidence is remembered by this man as nothing, it's either that he has an astonishingly bad memory, or that this is how the U.S. Law enforcement system treats people who are marginally attached to intelligence operations, covert operations, even controversial operations which are opposed by major elements of the U.S. government. Now, Borelli himself was not acting alone in this matter. His position was also that of the FBI, who said they too believed, quote, that Mr. Nosair had acted alone in shooting Rabbi Kahane. And then there's another FBI agent. The bottom line is that we can't connect anyone else to the Kahane shooting, an FBI agent said. So there's an MO here. And I want to go back to what I was saying at the very beginning. You end up having or somebody has pre-selected a candidate or candidates. And I didn't get into the question, of course, that there has to be a conspiracy theory about 9/11. You can't say that it was a lone nut acting alone. We say, in a sense, that it was 19 lone nuts all acting together. Just in case you don't know it, they identified all these names before 10 o'clock on that morning, and within 2 weeks, there were about 5 or 6 or 7 of them who said, in various places, nearly all of them turned out to be airline pilots, by the way, and they said, yeah, well, that's my name. yes, I went to that flight school. 2 or 3 of them said, that's my photograph that was published. But they also said, and you had to sympathize with their logic, it's not me because I'm still here and I'm still alive. And it was bad enough so that the Saudi government officially protested to the United States government, and the head of the FBI, bless him, Mueller, said at the time, well, there's some uncertainty about this and we'll have to look into it a bit more. Well, those of you, how many people have looked at the 9/11 report? So this is you're a virgin audience here. The 9/11 report has a great deal to say about the 19 hijackers, but it's never hinted that there had ever been a shadow of a suspicion as to who they really are, which is just one of the many indications that this was not a very profound investigation. And like the Warren report, they already knew where they had to end up because it had been predefined for them. But it's the combination that I want you to think about, that the pre-designated culprit, or culprits in 9/11 case, are in a sense unpursuable because they are a part of an operation which in the case of 9/11 is a scandal. I mean that these people could have been stopped back in 1990 and weren't. And I haven't gone into the whole Patrick Fitzgerald part of it. This is a very important book, by the way, Triple Cross. And he has another book, 1,000 Years of Deception, which is almost as important. My final words are words that I have said, I think, on many occasions, apropos of many subjects, that when we look at something like the JFK assassination, or we look at something like 9/11, or the two of them together, or we throw in, shall we say, Iran-Contra, or the shooting of Letellier, we're looking at meta-events, different events which, unlike most events, are not treated normally in the U.S. press, but become what John was calling this morning hidden history, and they're reserved for a special kind of treatment, and that implies, among other things, a special kind of audience, the people like here, who, because we stumbled on it somewhere, in this case JFK, we're open to the fact that it happens elsewhere. And as I've said in many cases, and I said at the beginning, and it's my final words to you, to understand any of these events in real depth, you've got to go beyond bullet angles in Dealey Plaza and films of that from the place, and look at what is ongoing in this country. And I'll remind you again of the possible involvement of the drug traffic, and to get to any kind of level where we can cope and deal with these kind of problems in our country, we have to see the continuity and deal with it at every time it surfaces. Because if we don't deal with it this time, and we probably won't, it will surface again. Thank you very much.
People have questions. And they have a little microphone to use.
Yeah, you know, we're using the microphone.
You said the FBI destroyed the files on Posada.
Yes.
What's the source for that?
This woman, Bardak, who interviewed him, she got an interview with him in '98. It's quite famous one. It's the New York Times story that figures in almost any treatment of Posada, where he was complaining that nobody was paying any attention to the fact that he had killed somebody. And she published that story, and he's danced around the story since then. Well, she's aware of what's happening because when people became more and more incensed at the treatment of Posada, the FBI decided they have to do something. So the Justice Department response was to subpoena the records of Bardak, the journalist, because and it became clear at that point they were doing so because they no longer had the files. So I can give you the URL, but if you Google for Bardak and Posada, you will read her story. The Washington Post gave quite ample publicity to this. And by the way, one of the things I didn't mention, that she did say, feeling guilty about the whole thing, they have now plea bargained and convicted 2 of his associates. One of them of interest to JFK people, Santiago Alvarez, who was a Cuban terrorist from SNFE, very close to Sierra Martinez, one of the people that Sierra Martinez recruited for his junta. And he's going to do a 2-year term. This is a kind of expiation for having, in effect, let Posada off the hook.
Thanks, Steve.
Yes, Mike. Mike, take the mic.
With reference to Cheney's back channel telephone calls, since the Air Force One at that point had no secured line, what good did it do Cheney to make a call on a secured line within the White House?
Oh, the plane had not taken off yet. It was they were fine on the ground, and there's no doubt the phone call took place. It was quite a long one, about 10 minutes, and it may have overlapped. Rumsfeld volunteered to some radio program that he spoke to the president and spoke to Cheney in the same period. And this is perhaps, to me, the most important central event in what was happening in the White House. And the 9/11 report says nothing about the Cheney-Rumsfeld phone call, which I suspect was more important even than the Cheney-Bush phone call, because Bush it's been predetermined that he will be out of the loop. And there wasn't, as you say, when you say not a secure phone line, what you really mean, there wasn't a phone line that worked very well. And so I don't know whether they knew that, and that's why there's another fascinating thing, that official accounts from people like Andy Card said, we were under threat in Tampa, and so we speeded down to the airport, and the plane took off almost vertically. Well, this is true, but it's leaving out that the plane sat on the ground for 10 minutes doing nothing while Bush and Cheney were having this important phone call or series of phone calls.
Well, when Cheney spoke to Bush, he's saying before the plane took off, where was Bush? Do you have any idea where Bush was?
You mean the front of the plane, the back of the plane? He was in the
He was in the plane.
I believe he was in the plane, yes, but I don't know that. But they could have had they did have a perfectly adequate phone connection when the plane was on the ground.
Okay, and the connection.
When he took off, then it was different. Yes.
Okay, I see.
It could have been a Secret Service car. They can patch a line.
Yeah, I'm sure it was WHCA Secret Service line. Yes.
Yes.
Any other questions? Rex.
People have probably already heard it, but you skipped over the Norman Mineta story.
That's the mic.
Keep the mic back there.
I did. I have 17,000 words in my book on the Norm Mineta story. All right, this is, let me remind you that we know of a stand-down order at 9:42 a.m., and we know of a shoot-down order that is later, and I would guess, certainly according to Richard Clark, while the plane was on the ground, which means before 9:54 a.m., sometime between 9:45 and 9:54, and I think that was pretty much continuous phone call. I think the plane was delayed because of the phone call. Now, Norm Mineta said...
I'm sure we could hear your question. What question are you
I just brought up Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation, who was in the...
in the bunker.
Yeah, in the bunker.
And I will give the stories he told it to Commission, but he's told it many times, and more interestingly elsewhere, that he arrived around 9:20. By the way, it's not in his prepared statement. It was elicited from him. That he arrived about 9:20, and at about 9:25, he heard reports coming in, which would be from the Secret Service, because, as I told you before, they had a direct line to what was showing on the screens at FAA and also NEADS, NEADS, the northeastern sector of NORAD. And a young man came in, said, "There's a plane coming in, it's 80 miles out." And Cheney sort of nods his head. And then the man comes back a little more concerned and said, "Sir, the plane is now 50 miles out." Cheney nods his head again. And then at some point, it was 20 miles or 10 miles, the young man can't restrain himself anymore. He says, sir, the plane is 10 miles out. Do the orders still stand? And Cheney says, of course. He shakes it like this. Of course the orders still stand. Did you hear me say anything different? Well, this raises all kinds of possibilities. Most people have worried about what were the orders. Was it... by the way, there's a version of this story in the 9/11 report, except it happens 1 hour later. And after 93 is on the ground.
So, shorter they're talking about?
And the problem is that there are no planes left in the air when the 9/11 report says it happened. And the explanation for the 9/11 report is that they're probably talking about an old track on a screen of a plane which was no longer there. But, I mean, how you could get this drama of 20 miles, 10 miles out of a single screen. Well, what interests me is what were those orders? It wasn't the stand-down order. It pretty clearly, I think, must have been an order, in effect, don't bother with that plane. But the stand-down order came at 9:42. And this, according to Mineta, was a little vague about when he reached the room. He said about 9:20, and I think he it may have been a bit later than that, because I think the key event, which is suppressed from the 9/11 report, was that this report did come in at 9:21. A plane is approaching Washington. And all hell broke loose in response to this report. That's when the planes were scrambled immediately. Within 60 seconds, they scrambled the planes from Langley. And it makes total sense that this was reported by the Secret Service in the bunker. How could they not report it in the bunker? Sometime after 9:21. And as I say, if Cheney really said anything like that, he was giving orders that he did not get from the president. And that's why I consider this whole thing to be so important. Now, let's see it from Cheney's point of view. First thing is, the only two dissident voices in the White House, both excellent eyewitnesses, are Richard Clark and Norm Mineta, and they are the two lone Democratic holdovers in a Republican White House. And they're being opposed, like for example, the evidence, so-called, for the episode having happened an hour later at 10:15 are personal notes from Lynn Cheney, Cheney's wife, and from Josh Bolton, who was, I think, one of Cheney's aides. In other words, Cheney people. Not, again, from, the Secret Service filed reports. Why don't you get a report from the Secret Service guy? That's where you would go. And where you see this deviousness, this avoiding of the primary contacts, you have to, it's a version of what you were saying this morning, that you have to smell a rat there.
Speaking of, if I could follow up, speaking of Democratic holdovers, people may not have heard the story a couple months ago. Jim Fetzer was on Fox TV, and the question came out, oh, come on, there's no evidence whatsoever the federal government could have been involved in this. He told the Norman Mineta story on there, and coincidentally, within, I think, about 24 hours, Norman Mineta submitted his resignation. This was a couple months ago.
Interesting. There's a much more important story. Exactly a year after 9/11, in 2002, Norman Mineta was interviewed by the top aviation security magazine, a very specialized audience. And he gave a very detailed account of what he was doing that day, including the stand-down order. The 9/11 report order says, as if no one had ever doubted it, that the stand-down order was given by a young man called Ben Sliney. It was his first day ever on the job, and almost immediately according to the report, he gave an order that has no precedent whatsoever in American history. But in this long interview, Mineta talks about the same order, and he's very clear. He said, I gave the order. It went to the acting number 2 of the FAA and to Jane Garvey, and they transmitted it to Sliney, and which I think is much more credible. And as of the plane coming in, He said he asked the acting head, the acting number 2 of FAA, what direction is it coming from? Which is a very relevant question because the report tries to say it was a phantom plane. They thought that that American 11, which crashed into the towers, they thought it was still in the air, and they say that the planes were dispatched to Baltimore. But Moneta says that he asked where it was coming, and he was told it was a downriver approach, meaning coming in from the west, which is virtually the route that 77 was following before it hit the Pentagon. And the 9/11 report gets very close to the edge of lying when they say that they had no knowledge of Flight 77, meaning that they knew a plane was coming in, but they didn't know what the plane was. And Keane and Hamilton go even closer to the edge of a lie in their book. They say it would have been impossible to shoot down the plane because they didn't know that 77 had been hijacked. Well, they knew a plane was approaching Washington. They could have shot it down without worrying about whether it was Flight 11 or Flight 77. So those are the kind of games that the report is playing. And I call this a hoax, that they're careful not to, it's very like the Warren Report in this respect. They don't exactly lie, but they distort and misrepresent and deceive in a way which can only be called a hoax. Now, I'm going to find out from the lawyers reading my book right now if you can say it's a hoax or whether they want me to fall back on a word like misrepresentation or something like that. But yes, Summer?
Could you elaborate a little more on the COG, continuity of government,
Oh,
that you were
yes,
talking about? And are we still under that order?
We don't know.
We don't know.
We
So
don't
we
know.
might be under martial law, they just haven't told us yet?
Well, no, I think in many ways we clearly are under the consequences of it having been declared. We know very, very little, but there are two things that I have to share. One is, this is what Oliver North was working on in the mid-1980s and led to a famous exercise called Rex 84. And then Alonzo Chardy did an article about it in the Miami Herald and said this was in effect a plan to suspend the Constitution and to detain large numbers of people. And Congressman Jack Brooks asked a question in the Iran-Contra hearings of Oliver North. And he said, is it true, Colonel North, that you were engaged in plans to suspend the American Constitution? And Senator Inouye, who was a Democrat, bang, 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 the gavel, we cannot go into that question here. Which is when it comes back to what I was saying about higher orders of classification. And then the second time, Jack asked a follow-up question. He said, we will have to deal with that in executive session. We have no knowledge of whether it was dealt with in executive session or not. Now, the New York Times, what?
It was.
It was.
And Louis Stokes emerged saying that there was no such plan.
Well, there was such a plan. And I could pursue that other thing further, but in the end, North resigns, and there's a feeling that Attorney General French had killed the plan. It didn't go anywhere. They're still working on the plans in the late 80s, and what is amazing is it's a group of about 17 people, of whom we know only 3. One was Congressman Dick Cheney from Wyoming. One was James Woolsey, who briefly was Director of Central Intelligence. And the third was the CEO of a drug company by the name of Donald Rumsfeld. He wasn't even in the government, and he was working on plans to suspend the government, of which Congress knew nothing, and the world had been told that these plans were not things. Now, they were working with FEMA, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. Keep your eyes on FEMA. And when the Bush II administration came in, Cheney was in rapid succession chair of 2 task forces. The first one was the Energy Task Force, which is the underpinnings for what we're doing now in Iraq. And when that was all wrapped up by April, it was announced on May 1st that he was going to do a new group that would plan to deal with terrorist attacks. In other words, plan to deal with 9/11. And who was he going to work with? FEMA. So in other words, they were restoring the kind of planning that we had had in the 1980s. And most of the books you read about COG will say, as the New York Times said, and what was once true, the historical truth, it was planning to deal with a nuclear attack. That's where it began. But most sources don't mention, and I will in my book, that in 1988, Reagan passed an executive order saying that these were plans to deal with any major emergency, and they defined it in such a way that 9/11 would be covered. And the proof of the pudding is that on that day, before 10 o'clock, in fact, part of this triple order I was telling you about, the same thing that involved the shoot-down order, the most important part was the institution of COG. It did happen. There's two sentences in the 9/11 report admitting that it did happen. Warrantless wiretapping, a lot of things that Cheney wanted. And if you want to know Cheney's political ideology, read the minority report in the Iran-Contra report, because Cheney was the principal author with his sidekick Addington, who is now his number 2 in the vice president's office. They drafted a report saying, Watergate was a terrible mistake. They shouldn't have exposed all those things. The president should have been allowed to do everything he did. And essentially the Cheney-Rumsfeld agenda for 30 years has been to undo the church reforms, get Congress out of the intelligence review, and go back to letting the government do what it wants, which was very heavy in the 1970s when we were still having black riots and all kinds of things. Not only surveillance of individuals, but plans for the detention of large numbers of individuals. And I just got a Project Censored award for my article about how Halliburton was given an award a contract award to build large numbers of detention centers, part of a 10-year program which was initiated, guess when? September 2001. In other words, I am pretty sure the Washington Post told us that about 100 officials left Washington, lived in these hollowed out mountains that were prepared for a nuclear attack, and did something. And none of us know what they did. I think they prepared I don't know if torture would be part of what they prepared, but I'm pretty sure that the warrantless surveillance, which is what Cheney wanted under COG, and other features. You know, by the way, that for the first time in history, we are now living in a military district of the U.S. Army. The continental United States is now NORTHCOM, and they're conducting military exercises in this country. There used to be something called Posse Comitatus Act, which, by the way, one of the people in the Rex 84 stage was arguing then has to be ended. We need military occupation, and we now have it. And they've had war games in the city of Washington, and we don't really know what the war games were, but there has been a very intense militarization of America. And the man who in 2003 and 2004 was publishing articles saying, this is a good thing, we need it, we need to get rid of Posse Comitatus, which never meant what people said it meant, is the same man who was saying this when he was working with Oliver North back in the 1980s. So there is a real continuity there. And I think this is one reason why I think this last election was very important. If this had been an election which validated what has been happening for the last 6 years, it's hard to see how it could have happened that way. I mean, if we have any faith in America left. Greg Palast predicted that this election would be faked, just like 2000 and 2004. You should read his book, by the way, Armed Madhouse. It's a very important book, but he was wrong. 2008 didn't go that way, and 2006, sorry, yes. Is that the year? I'm a bit ahead of my time here, sorry. Yes, Summer?
In relation to, like, the possibility of martial law, et cetera, do you have any thoughts on the change in the passport laws? By 2008, it will be illegal for Americans to pass into Mexico or Canada without a passport. Do you think that they're going to close the borders? Because I don't see that as a thing to keep people out. That sounds like something to keep people out.
They can go out without one, but they can't get back in.
Yeah, so anyway, I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that, since they're changing everything to do with our ability to even leave the country at this point.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the bad news is that Canada's changing too. So we can't blame it all on on Cheney and Rumsfeld, much as I would like to. The whole world is changing. First time I ever had my eyeballs blasted for a check on my irises was going into China. The whole world is moving in this direction. Whether the whole world could be turned around on this, I think, depends on what will happen in Iraq and Al-Qaeda and the war on terrorism and Iran and so on. I'm not a total pessimist. I'm much less pessimistic now, and have been for a year, than I was back in 2003, when it just seemed that we were full speed ahead into a totally new era of American history. That, I don't totally approve of Mike Rupert's book, but the title, Crossing the Rubicon, I think we were crossing a kind of Rubicon then. But the Rubicon is a river you can go back and forth on. Yes?
I want to mention something.
Get the mic, Mike.
I want to mention something.
Mike.
I want to mention something, and I think it's pretty much in support of the theory you're presenting right now. My brother worked for General Electric, and he worked in the defense sector.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in overseas purchasing. And basically, he told me this was, I'd say this was 20 years or more ago. All right? They were given very specific he had high security clearance. He was given very specific directions. For instance, how to remain inconspicuous.
Uh-huh.
In an airport, in any public place. He was also specifically told that there were certain countries he was not supposed to step foot in.
Uh-huh.
He was not supposed to use his visa. And unlike what the government tells us, that our government will protect our citizens no matter where they go, that's a big lie. That's a big fraud. And he told me that. Because he said if he went in certain countries where GE warned him not to go, that he only flew on Swiss Air because they didn't trust American Airlines or any other airlines. If he was taken in custody, he was basically told, don't expect GE, don't expect your government to bail you out. That's what he was told. And that was over 20 years ago.
Which countries were these, do you know?
Hope it wasn't Canada.
Well, one of them, ironically, my mother came from Poland, and one of the countries was Poland, believe
Yes.
it or not.
Well, 20 years ago, that's understandable, yes.
Because my father asked him, well, why did you stop in Poland on the way? Because he dealt with Switzerland, he dealt with Liechtenstein, he dealt with Germany, France. He did company in Italy.
Uh-huh.
He did business with company. And basically he was told, don't go there.
But
I have to say, I'm not...
Why would they pick certain countries not to protect him and other countries they would protect him? What was the concept that underwrote those orders? What was the explanation?
Well, I'd like to volunteer there that I think it had more to do with his status, and that what they were really trying to do was to make sure he didn't get into the hands of certain governments because of what he knew. And it was probably not something that applied to everybody, but applied to him.
Except for the first year when he worked in Louisville, Kentucky. He was on a training program
Uh-huh.
in the appliance division. Except for that year, every year of the year, he was in the defense sector.
Well, I
So
can't...
unlike what our government tells us that they're going to protect us, that's a bunch of crap. It just doesn't fly.
If he had
Take
knowledge,
Mike.
if your brother had knowledge that could compromise, national security, why don't the GE people just say to him, part of the contract is that you not go there because you may be seized by enemy agents or whatever. And, it's really bad for the security of this government. We can't protect you because they won't want to. They're not going to want to play cricket with us. I mean, it would seem to me that, sure, there are certain people who might have very vital knowledge about the technological aspect of our, technological, not ideological aspect of our defense. And these people, there may be a very legitimate security reason in saying, stay away from dangerous areas. There are people who want your mind. But this could seem to be honest and just a normal national security procedure, not a procedure to in any way limit our basic freedoms.
I don't think we should pursue this much further, but I think a factor here, excuse me, a factor here is that your brother and you had relatives behind what was still the Iron Curtain, which at one point would have denied him a security clearance altogether. And I think that maybe in this case it was kind of a conditional clearance that he could work in this area, but with the proviso that he could not go to countries like Poland. But I think we're getting a bit off the subject from the subject. Excuse me, I think we're getting off the subject.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, this has been going on for years, like you said. It's been going on for years.
Mike has a question.
Peter, I wonder if you can comment on one other similarity between the JFK assassination and 9/11, having to do with preparedness exercise. I mean, we know that Cheney had a preparedness exercise for exactly what happened on 9/11.
Yes.
You know, in essence. And it's been surmised that, well, we don't know as a fact, but there was also a simulated attack exercise or preparedness.
On that day, yes.
On November 22nd. 63, and that's why the Secret Service didn't react.
That was one of the things. I've been trying to remember, what else did I want to talk about? Yes, thank you very much. That's quite true, yes. That's quite true, and quite arresting. Yes?
My favorite comparison is that they put the Fox in charge of the investigation of the Fox's that the comparison between putting Alan Dulles in charge of the Warren Commission, in charge of the investigative aspect of the Warren Commission, and then trying to appoint Henry Kissinger to head the 9/11 Commission. I think that you can make a very, very good case that Kissinger is a prime suspect for having played the same role that Dulles played in the Kennedy assassination. That Kissinger certainly was in a position and had all the contacts to play the same role in the events of 9/11. And if you're going to draw that parallel, I find it useful and interesting.
Well, if I could add a word to that, I was very interested that Lee Hamilton, the Democrat co-chair, was appointed to that position because in 1991 I wrote a book called Cocaine Politics, and I objected to the really conspiratorial role that Lee Hamilton played in order to neutralize the idea that Contras had been involved with drug trafficking. And I don't know if I should bore you with the details, but it was clever, it was manipulative, it involved very close coordination of dates, and Lee Hamilton was a principal in it, even though he was supposed to be the Democrat in charge of finding out what was happening about Contras and drugs. Yes?
Yes, sir. Who do you believe gave the order to kill Barry Seals? And do you think that the people who did the shooting when Barry Seals was killed were actually agents of Ochoa and Escobar, or that they were with someone else?
Well, it could have been both. You know, we know where they got the gun, and the gun came from Max Mermelstein, I believe, in Miami, who was very involved in the finance end of the Colombian cocaine connection. So that, yes, the Colombians were involved, but he was essentially set up by the U.S. government. So it was a collaboration. And you say, what? The U.S. government collaborating with drug traffickers? Absolutely, that's what it was, yes. And very important, but perhaps not quite as important as some people have said.
Peter, just related one more time to your continuity of government ideas. It seems to me that we've entered into a permanent state of war, that our government is trying to make that. And in that kind of state, we operate under different rules. And it started, I think, with the drug war, and we allowed that to
Right.
to happen, and now it's happening with the war
On terrorism. Yes, yes, that's very well
What are your
put.
comments?
And of course, what you're saying is almost paraphrasing President Bush. You know, that's what they want, is to keep us in a permanent state of war and to permanently suspend. You know, we often say the American Constitution, but I should have mentioned habeas corpus. They suspended habeas corpus. Habeas corpus goes back to the 13th century. It's been a mark of civilized life in Anglo-Saxon countries for 600 or 700 years. And America was opting out of that civilized tradition. So, you know, in this much used phrase, a clash of civilizations, civilizations don't clash, barbarisms clash. And we were being rapidly barbarized, losing the marks of a civilized legal system. That is essentially what the war on terror has meant. And I am very embarrassed that a colleague of mine at the University of California, John Yoo, has been part of that. John Yoo now cannot go to Germany because if he goes there, he will be arrested as a war criminal. Yes?
Do you think that the vast majority of American people, if polled, would vote in favor of national security over individual rights?
I think it depends on the context. And at a certain point, for example, right after 9/11, you bet they would have. Would they do it today? I think perhaps not, because they've seen the emergence of a different culture which is based on the suspension of individual rights. And I think very appropriately, they don't like what they see. And of course, they may like it for other reasons, like the war in Iraq, or there's many reasons why they do it. But a question like that, it can't be put as abstractly as that. It would depend in what circumstances the question was put. And I would not have wanted to see that question put in 2001, but I think today we're moving back to a saner and more traditional American view of things. And that's my hope, anyway. Yes, always remember to use the mic.
I was curious if Jim Bath was still the favorite op for the Bush brothers. It seems like they teamed up with him quite a bit at various stages.
Yes, they did. Jim Bath, the question is about Jim Bath, and when the younger George Bush was getting started in the oil business, a friend of his called Jim Bath, who had no money but had access to money, invested, I think, $50,000 in his oil company. And there seems to be no doubt that it came from two Arab investors who were using Jim Bath as a cutout. And the name of one of them you may not recognize, bin Mahfouz, who was briefly indicted in connection with the BCCI. He won't be mentioned in my book because of a series of angry emails I had from his lawyers. And so I'm blaming it on the other brother, whose name was Salem bin Laden, and he's the brother of Osama bin Laden. So when people are talking about the Bush bin Laden connection, they're not making it up. It goes way back to George W. Bush's first oil company, and it carries right down to orders given right after 9/11 to get the bin Ladens out of the country as fast as you can. And there's dispute as to whether the FBI was allowed to interview them before they left or not. One of them, Abdullah bin Laden, was definitely an object of FBI interest because of his association with WAMI, the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, which has been accused of financing Al-Qaeda. But they were got out of the country immediately. There's been whole books written about this. Yes?
Two questions. One is, this business of suspending the Constitution and having these prison camps that are being set up. Is it possible, now that it's been 5 years since 9/11, that the bad people have been moving a little bit too slowly, so that there's been a kind of a counter-reaction of indignation building up that would make it much harder, because if the American people really don't approve of this, it's harder to do it than if they do. I mean, do they need another terrorist attack to get their power back, or?
Oh, my friends have been predicting terrorist attack. They were sure there'd be one before the election.
I said, do we need?
What?
No, I said, do we need? I mean, it's taken so long. They haven't yet, at least officially, suspended the Constitution, just a lot of its liberties. And if they wanted to make a real move to get people like us into concentration camps, would there be enough, would they have enough of the American people behind them to make it easy for them to do this at this point?
Well, this could be a very long answer. The issue is basically no, they would not have the American people. It's complicated by very strong racist American feelings about immigration. And that's what they pinned the detention camps on. They actually said in Homeland Security, we want to be able to deal with all of the illegal immigrants in this country. Well, think about that. There are 11 million illegal immigrants in this country. Are they really planning to build detention centers for 11 million people? I don't know what to say about that. But I think it's important to say to your question that if the American Constitution ever is effectively suspended, we probably won't know it. And it's a bit like what happened to Rome. A lot of people think Caesar crossed the Rubicon and said the Roman Republic is over. From now on, I'm the emperor. It wasn't like that at all. He didn't do anything to think. They went on having senators and consuls and equites, knights, and so on. It's just that they didn't have any power anymore. And I think it's quite easy to imagine, and maybe we've already arrived there, that you have a Congress that continues to pass laws and a president who continues to make signing statements on the laws, and we will think we still have a democracy, but in fact we don't. And I have to say that the truth is somewhere, I think, in between. But we will lose the democracy if we don't fight to get it back. That I do feel very strongly about.
One other question. I'm sorry. Can I? You mentioned, emails from Mahfouz's lawyers. How much of your I'm interested in free press because I think that has a lot to do with our basic freedoms. How much of your writing has been censored by lawyers?
Well, this is the second book I've had lawyered. The first one never appeared. The lawyers killed it. That was Beyond Conspiracy in 1980. That's what turned me into a poet. I had a sort of nervous breakdown and wrote Coming to Jakarta instead. So I'm now grateful to those lawyers. But they had the nerve, after 5 years, I had a letter asking for the advance back. And I wrote back a very short letter and said, I'm not litigious, but if you sue me, I'll sue you, and I will win. And then I got a phone call, and they said, well, you understand there were some legal issues not resolved. I said, name me one. And that was the end of it. Never heard, but the book never came out. But the best of it is in Deep Politics, so it's okay. It's probably time to move on, is it, John? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.